Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to John Cofrancesco, the founder of American AI Logistics, about the future of government contracts in the age of artificial intelligence, and much more. And then we break down the United Nations General Assembly in New York, the latest Russian provocations in and around NATO airspace, and why the Pentagon is picking a fight with reporters. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times. I'm joined as always by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. More news than we can possibly fit into a 35-minute show this week. Guy and I spent some time at the Airspace and Cyber Conference down at National Harbor. Threat Status already has some great content out from that show with plenty more still to come. And here on the podcast, we have a fascinating interview coming up with John Cofrancesco, the founder of American AI Logistics, about major changes unfolding inside the government in terms of contracting and procurement, how agencies are using or not using artificial intelligence, and more. So stay tuned for that. But before we get there, Guy, first things first, as always, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. It's great to be here with you for another week. There was obviously the United Nations General Assembly, which I know you're going to get into, and I have something on a little later in the show. That's always just makes for a very hectic global security and geopolitics news week every year in September. While we covered that pretty closely, we focused quite a bit in recent days on what's at the top of my list, which was what went on at this big air, space, and cyber conference that just wrapped up in National Harbor, Maryland. You were there with me, others from the Threat Status team. We actually made some cool video from the floor of the conference. People can find that on the Threat Status pages at the Washington Times. This is a massive weapons show and basically a defense industry networking event with the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Space Force, and top commanders from other services. A lot of futuristic stuff on display, from directed energy weapons designed to neutralize drone swarms to plans for the Golden Dome missile defense shield. Of course, Ben, with regard to Golden Dome, there was a lot of behind-the-scenes talk at AFA. Sorry, the conference itself is called AFA because it's hosted every year by the Air and Space Forces Association. There was a lot of behind-the-scenes talk that the Trump administration's Golden Dome czar, General Michael Gutlein, is close, as in any day now, to revealing the architectural plan for the Golden Dome missile shield. Everyone in the space and missile wings of the defense industrial complex is highly curious about how much of it will be space-based and how much of it will be totally classified and how much of it will get leaked out. We, of course, are tracking that in the Threat Status Daily newsletter. One big takeaway from this conference, Ben, was the shift in posture this year by the Air Force and the Space Force on the threat posed by China in space and just in aerospace generally. Top U.S. military intelligence officials warned at the conference that China is developing and deploying next-generation fighter jet prototypes and launching advanced satellites at an alarming pace. There was a panel discussion titled The China Threat. At that discussion, Space Force and Air Force officials said they see Beijing as wanting to replace the U.S. as the preeminent power in control of the orbiting assets that undergird global military dominance at this point, particularly on the communications front. The whole concept of joint force integration that sets the U.S. military apart from just about the entire world relies on space-based satellite communications and GPS. I personally reported on this China threat panel. Ben, listeners can read my whole deep dive on it by Googling Intel Chiefs China Threats Space. We also had national security correspondent Bill Gertz covering it. He focused on the threat of U.S.-China escalation in space. And at the same time, Ben, another of our Threat Status correspondents, Vaughn Cocaine, covered U.S. Space Force Chief of Space Operations General B. Chance Saltzman's speech about the service's push push to accelerate the deployment of new technologies in space. Salzman specifically referenced the launch of the Space Development Agency's Tranche 1 proliferated architecture. That's a new U.S. military satellite constellation that the agency says will consist of 154 operational space vehicles, including more than 24 so-called tracking layer vehicles in orbit, as well as missile defense demonstration vehicles. I could go on and on here, Ben. I want to switch gears one more time quickly, though. One other thing on my radar is this fallout, or should I say, ongoing question swirling around the allegedly malicious telecommunications network that U.S. Secret Service and the Department of Homeland Security uncovered and dismantled at sites in and around New York City as the UN General Assembly was happening in recent days. This is a truly bizarre plot, Ben. It was uncovered by U.S. officials who said these sites could have been used to disable cell phone towers, disrupt communications among first responders, eavesdrop on private conversations among diplomats at the General Assembly, and so on. But it's really unclear who set this whole thing up. One former U.S. intelligence community official told us that drug cartels may have used the sites to intercept law enforcement or federal government agency communications in the area, suggesting that the network had nothing to do with UNGA, or United Nations General Assembly, and world leaders gathering. But we also heard from Threat Status opinion contributor Dan Hoffman, himself a former CIA clandestine services officer, that the telecom plot, it could have been tied to foreign intelligence agencies. And one of the weirdest things about it, Ben, is that apparently 80 grams of cocaine were also found at one of the sites that U.S. officials raided that had all this nefarious telecom equipment set up. Basically, these were apartments in and around New York City.
It's interesting, and you mentioned some of the sources that you and I both talked to this week about that incident, and the 80 grams of cocaine kind of threw both of us when we read that in the story, because if it is some plot, by the Chinese or the Russians, you wouldn't imagine that professionals would do something like that. But then you're reminded that often, governments, if they're, allegedly undertaking operations like this, are often hiring just criminals from the dark web. So you're not necessarily getting, top of the line, world-class intelligence operatives straight out of, an episode of 24 or Homeland. You could just be literally getting some of the world's dumbest criminals who leave cocaine at the site.
So mercenaries, essentially. At the same time, this is such a weird plot that I'm trying to figure out, was this actually real, or was this more about optics? We're still tracking it and following the Secret Service and Homeland Security on what all they find out.
Of course. Well, to follow up on the UN guy, President Trump, of course, gave a highly anticipated address there and once again trashed the UN. What is the purpose of the United Nations, Trump asked. And this is a topic that seems to come up just about every year. What can the UN really do, given its makeup? 5 permanent members of the Security Council, Russia and China's veto power. We can go on, and we have in the Washington Times. We explore that topic more in depth this week. But another thing that Trump said that really got all of our attention is this. He said this week that NATO should shoot down Russian aircraft or drones that violate its airspace. This is important because that's happened quite a few times recently. Late last week, the Russians allegedly violated Estonian airspace. Same things allegedly happened in Romania. The Russians, of course, deny this. Earlier this month, Russian drones flew into Polish airspace, and some of them were shot down. The first time NATO has ever engaged aircraft in its airspace. So this is a big deal because it says that Trump seemingly is on board with European nations, with NATO getting more aggressive in pushing back militarily on Russian provocations. And how did Russia respond? Well, within about 24 hours of those comments, 4 Russian warplanes flew into the Alaskan Air Defense Identification Zone near Alaska and were intercepted by U.S. fighter jets. Now, the Russian planes never actually entered U.S. airspace. We've talked before in the show about the ADIZ near Alaska, and even NORAD in its press release acknowledged that the Russians routinely, I think regularly was the word they used, fly into that airspace. But this kind of stuff is rarely a coincidence, and I don't think it's a coincidence here that the Russians made, a relatively mild statement, but a statement nonetheless in pushing the bounds of international airspace, just a few hours after President Trump mentioned the idea of shooting down some of those Russian planes and drones over Europe. So to switch gears, Guy, quickly before we get to our great interview this week, we need to talk about these new rules put out by the Pentagon on journalists' access to the building and perhaps even more importantly, attempted restrictions on what they report. Now, this story broke last Friday after our show came out. So this is the first opportunity we've had to talk about it on the air. It's not the first time Guy and I have talked about it, period, because as you can imagine, it's been a pretty hot topic among journalists over these past few days. And even Jimmy Kimmel mentioned this during his highly anticipated monologue on his return show earlier this week. So what are these new rules? Well, first, they cement restrictions already in place on where reporters can go inside the building. When I was a full-time Pentagon correspondent during the first Trump administration, you could roam around much of the building. Not everywhere, of course, but a lot of the hallways or corridors, as they say. You were free to go into offices, meet with sources, just the vast majority of anywhere inside the Pentagon. Now, you can't. Much of that area is restricted. There are other changes we could talk about around things like parking, which of course is a complete snoozer of an issue for a lot of people listening. But if you work at or visit the Pentagon, you know how big of a deal parking is there. But Guy, this is the heart of the issue and the most problematic part of these new rules. Reporters are asked to sign a document promising they won't release any information not approved by the government. And we're not just talking about classified or sensitive information, any information at all, meaning they only want us to report on stuff they put out in press releases, public speeches, press conferences, and the like. So, I mean, this is obviously would be a big change in how reporters in the United States of America report on the world's most powerful and largest military, to only say essentially what the government approves of you saying. Now, one of the questions I have is, is the Pentagon actually going to follow through with this? One thing they threatened to do is to cancel our press passes in the Pentagon. They're known as PFACs, or Pentagon Facilities Alternative Credentials, hard passes, badges, any number of terms in the industry. But basically, it's the identification that you have that recognizes you're a member of the resident press corps and have access to the building without going through the intensive screening process and vetting that you have to if you're a visitor. There are similar processes in place at the White House, where I've also had a hard pass, at the State Department, where Guy has, and in other departments across Washington. So, look, is this a scare tactic, a public relations move? Even President Trump said he doesn't think it's going to work. He said nothing stops reporters when he was asked about it earlier this week. It's also highly likely to be struck down by courts, as it appears to be a pretty obvious violation of the First Amendment. You could read more about that angle in an in-depth piece I have coming out soon in the Washington Times. But Guy, I just thought it was worth highlighting this because, whatever you think about reporters or media outlets or whether they're biased, maybe a lot of them are, who knows these days, but there are fundamental things we should all stand up for in this country. And the idea of government-approved news just on its face seems pretty absurd. And we are joined now by John Cofrancesco, the founder of American AI Logistics. John, we're excited to have you here in the show to talk about government contracts, AI, and a lot of other things. Thanks so much for coming on the Threat Status Podcast.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
Of course. Well, thank you for being here. And right off the top, John, I'll rather let you explain this than me try to do it. Can you tell us what American AI Logistics does?
Yeah, well, we really do two things. The first is that we automate the bidding process for RFQs. So our clients are companies who sell aircraft engine parts, toilet paper, software, and everything in between. And before us, that was a very manual process. Today, using agentic technology, it's an automated process. The second thing we do is, through all the data we've collected and gathered, we provide deep analytics into the supply chain. So we help our clients and their clients, often the U.S. government, to understand how long is it going to take to procure something, what's the best price to procure something, and where can you get it most efficiently. So we're really a company that sort of lives in the data and then helps to automate all the processes.
Okay. Well, it certainly sounds like you're the absolute perfect person then to talk about some of these issues that we're going to bring up here. And let's start with this, because a lot of our listeners do business with the federal government. Some of them are in government. But to a degree, I think this kind of flew under the radar of mainstream media coverage, at least. And that's the executive order signed by President Trump earlier this year to consolidate domestic federal procurement within the General Services Administration. The idea to eliminate waste and duplication, giving the GSA more power in this space. Can you explain, sort of, for our listeners and also for me and for Guy, in layman's terms, what exactly this means and how things have changed because of this in how the government does its business. What did this EO, this executive order, actually do?
It's still in the process of doing. So we're going to see what it actually does. But the intent behind it's really clear. It's to say, hey, government, you guys buy a lot of the same things between the agencies. Let's buy them in a way that's smarter so the taxpayer gets a better deal. And the agent for doing that is supposed to be GSA. And this EO is really trying to centralize a lot of the purchasing power back into GSA away from the agencies. How that's going to happen, where that's going, still up in the air, and lots of details to talk about.
Yeah, well, so let's talk about some of those, because I'm trying to understand how that approach would work in relation to, specifically if you're talking about major, national security initiatives or projects. For example, we talk a lot on the show about, just for example, the Golden Dome missile shield, and how General Michael Gutlein, who's overseeing the project, wants to have significant authority over things that he needs to buy and which companies are involved. That's just one example. But is there a danger, I guess, of unintended consequences where an increased role for the GSA actually kind of slows things down and makes it more complicated for departments and agencies to get what they need quickly?
So, Ben, Guy, I'm just going to give you my where I'm coming from on this, and then I'll jump into those details. I voted for Trump 3 times. I am on board with saving the taxpayer money. And I believe in the overall strategy of let's centralize things that can be centralized. But the tactics that are being employed are unfortunately, to date, it's going to cause a lot of blowback, and it is going to cause a lot of actual increase of inefficiency. And specifically what you talked about, as it turns out, GSA as an organization is just slower than some of the alternative organizations that are out there. So a lot of that is really up in the air right now. We don't know as industry what's going to happen. I can tell you as a data guy that some of the things that are being talked about are actually going to yield higher costs to the taxpayer, not lower costs. And that's really where my concern is. So again, I'm coming from a place where big supporter of the goal, huge supporter of the strategy, but I want to make sure those tactics are going to yield the right result.
Of course. And one more quickly on this before I bring Guy in and we kind of drill more into the AI aspects around all of this. I mean, you obviously work closely with folks across government. So I'm just curious if maybe you can kind of lift the curtain for our listeners a little bit. Do you get the sense just from your own anecdotal evidence and your own experiences here, is there kind of a turf war or a protective, element to all of this where, the Pentagon or the State Department, whoever we're talking about here, is protective of the way that they want to do things in terms of procurement contracts? Maybe they don't want the GSA or anybody else, DOGE, for example, taking any of that power away from them. How do those power dynamics actually work behind the scenes in your experience?
Well, there's a ton of that, right? There's definitely this is my soup bowl. Don't you go in it. This is my turf. Don't touch it. But I actually want to just take a step away from that, because no matter who's in power and what they're trying to do, that is just the universal truth of humans in government. But there's actually numbers behind this that warrants a discussion. So if you're familiar with the big contract vehicles, there are a number of them out there. They're called best in class, which is a termination that it looks like OMB may change. But this best in class is really contract vehicles that enable other agencies to go purchase things at a really good price. Across the government, there are actually a lot of examples of best in class that really aren't that great. But there's one example that is fantastic. And even compared to the commercial markets, it's fantastic. And that's NASA. NASA runs a best-in-class vehicle called SOUP. And to put a fine point on this, they have 140 employees at NASA SOUP. They executed more than 50,000 contracts last year on the smallest fee in government. So they basically work for their money. They get a 0.3% fee on everything that goes through, and they paid for themselves. So at NASA, they are the gold standard. And if you take that, and again, I love GSA, I've worked at GSA, but if you take GSA, it has thousands of employees. It executed roughly the same number of contracts when you look at the mass schedules. It does so for a fee that's more than twice as much, and it's much, much slower, and it's not self-funded. So when we talk about the tactics that are now being discussed, my concern is that we're going to take the folks who've been the best, the fastest drivers around the track, take them out of the car, and we're going to give the folks who've not been so quick around the track access to all the controls. So when we talk hard numbers here, there's no getting around it. There are some real folks in government done a great job, and there are some folks who may now end up with more power who've not been so exemplary.
John, it's Guy Taylor. I just want to, so listeners know, I really appreciate your reference to NASA SEWP. It's NASA SEWP. If people are listening and haven't heard of it, they can easily look it up. That's pretty interesting. I have a kind of philosophical question that I want to ask you relating to just the broader explosion of technology that we're seeing across the defense landscape, the economy, all of national security. And how does that fast explosion of just evolution of technology that's happening, how does that impact contracts and procurement? How hard is it to plan long-term contracts today, given the pace of technological innovation? Are you of the view that what's cutting edge today could be outdated a month or 6 months from now? And if so, do we need to just completely rethink the length and structure of how contracts are handled, especially at places like the Pentagon?
I think there's a lot of change in the market, but I think that we have an analogous situation. So if you actually, and I'm going to get really into the nerd stuff here, Guy, if you actually look at what America was doing in the late 30s, there was a similar explosion in technology and a change in procurement. So there's a guy who all Americans should know, but they don't remember his name. His name is Bill Knudsen. They used to call him the Great Dane, a Danish immigrant. And if you've ever heard the term arsenal of democracy, not only did this man coin that term, he's the man that delivered the arsenal of democracy. He left Detroit as one of the highest paid Americans in the country at the time, working for GM, to come work for $1 for FDR in order to prepare our arsenal of democracy. So he went through a lot of the same trials and tribulations when he came to DC, changing technology, the need for fast-paced acquisition. Obviously, we were heading towards a war. The folks in Washington understood that. And I would love for folks in procurement who haven't studied what he did, go back and study it, because what he did then is he went to trusted organizations in the commercial industry, got them contracts, sometimes, I kid you not, on the back of a napkin, went lightning fast, but said to them, hey, we're going to expect you to keep pace with the change in tech. We're going to expect you to deliver on time at a reasonable profit. So there's absolutely things that need to change, but it's kind of this comeback story. We need to look at what happened in the late 30s, early 40s, replicate that, because that's what's going to give us what we need to move quick and move effectively.
Maybe we could be looking at an arsenal of artificial intelligence with regard to AI in contracting. How can artificial intelligence specifically actually help the government, the Pentagon, the State Department? I mean, does AI comb through requests and proposals and other contracting documents? Is that already happening? How is AI actually being used in the process now?
Guy, so yeah, that my company does that, right? We do that for the commercial industry. We actually go through all of the procurement data that's publicly available in the government. We tell our clients, we say, hey, the government's buying this object for, $100 a unit. You could probably procure that for $70 a unit, and you can procure it in advance of their needing it. So if you want to get out ahead and have it X stock rather than on delivery, you can do that. We and other companies are now taking that to the government and saying to them, hey, let's purchase smarter. And I'll say that's a difficult conversation in a lot of places, because you have a lot of folks who are very accustomed to doing business in a certain way. They're now being shown, because of AI, information that says, hey, there's a better way. Like all human factors, there's some people who are ready to take the leap, and then there's some people who are very resistant. But that is the crux of it. If you actually look at supply chains overall, every interim step between the real producer and the real user creates an opportunity for value. It also creates an opportunity for procurement friction. And what AI is doing is it's smoothing out that procurement cycle. It's smoothing out that friction. So the cost of goods in the long run should come down from a procurement perspective. We're beginning to see that in some places, but like I said, there's still lots of resistance, lots of folks who want to keep us in the 2005, 2006 slow-mo sort of way of doing things.
So you may have already answered this a little bit right then, but also with your NASA SEWP example, but are various agencies now using AI differently in that contracting process? I mean, is the GSA, for example, setting broad rules of the road for agencies and departments across the government to use, or do you have different arms of the federal government using AI differently? And I'm assuming the answer to that is yes, but please enlighten us. And then could that create problems?
Guy, it's all of the above right now. So from agency to agency, the rules are different. From PM to PM within the same agency, the rules are different. Here are the things that we're seeing to be true, sort of broad scale. First is that agencies are now interested in AI-based solutions. So if you're selling a technology that has AI components, they're interested because, for obvious reasons, they want to be more efficient. When it comes to procurement, for some agencies that are jumping ahead, GSA's put out an RFI on this recently, saying, "Hey, we want help." Other agencies very reticent to use AI as judgment. They're afraid they're going to catch a lawsuit. Other agencies are telling contractors, don't use AI in your RFP proposals, which of course everybody is. So it's really all over the place. I think this is one of the cases where we should let the market decide. And I don't just mean the market in terms of the commercial market. I actually mean the government market. The government does a lot of different things. It is not one government in the sense that it has one unified mission. It's actually it's a conglomerate. It's like a 1980 style Japanese conglomerate where you have one parent company, but all these sub companies. And, the government runs a big hotel chain for the military. They run the military. They run a huge healthcare organization at the VA. They run a housing organization at HUD. They run regulatory. So if you just go down the list of things government does, they have different needs within those agencies. So at some level, it's best to let them operate as individual organizations with some broad set rules. So I think in AI land, we're still figuring it all out. And I think that's good. And I think we should continue to let the market do as it's doing. Let the market figure it out over time. We don't have to have all the answers today.
John, if I can go back quickly to your the example or analogy you wanted to draw back to the 1930s and sort of how this plays out with respect to technology. Does the size of government bureaucracy and just the number of people that are involved today versus even back then, I don't know if, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know if a contract written on the back of a napkin would necessarily, fly with Congress or other stakeholders or potential legal challenges, et cetera, today. How does the different landscape in terms of just the size and the scope of government maybe challenge the idea that you mentioned earlier?
Well, actually, if you study that era of history, you'd find that, it's almost to the man, the same issues that they had then we have today. The bureaucracy, if you read some of the stories of what these people were experiencing, what really changed it is that at the top, FDR was a transformational leader. We were at a very dangerous time in our history. So they were willing to do things that, many perceived as risky, but ultimately were required. We are not at a dissimilar time now. We have a real threat in China. We have a huge debt. We have economic problems, just like we're coming out of the Great Depression. And we now have technological changes. We really got to make a change. So those human dynamics are still there. They're actually not changed. What I will say now is that government has its fingers in much more things than it did in the 30s. So, if you think about the TVA, you think about the other sort of, programs that FDR put together, those were just the sort of very beginnings of government getting involved in citizens' lives in a lot of ways. Today, although some of those organizations no longer exist, some do, the government's just much more expansive. So it does create more bureaucracy in the sense the government's bigger, but the core issues of, hey, this is my rice bowl, or hey, this is the way we do it, same issues, different decade. And the way to get through that is to empower the really smart folks and the folks who are really committed to the mission of making government better and letting them take a little bit of risk, letting them drive forward. And I think we'll get there. Frankly, I am so positive on this administration's push to make change. Doesn't mean every change is going to be successful for sure, but there's definitely an opportunity to do that. And as it relates to GSA and this one government, I'm super excited that they've brought in folks from industry who are really smart, do come from VC, that have experience. I just want to make sure that they're implementing tactics that are going to yield that result. And that's, I think, where it's still very fuzzy and there's work to be done.
Okay. John, last thing here before we wrap up, and you kind of touched on some of this earlier when you gave examples of how AI is helping in these processes already. But I'm curious, just sort of broadly speaking, how you see this idea, this fear in some industries of AI, sort of replacing human beings. That's of course is a fear in the media business among many others that AI essentially will take jobs and replace the work of living, breathing humans. I know we could spend hours talking about that very sort of existential question almost, but as somebody who's working in the AI space every day, how do you see that from sort of the 30,000-foot view? Is AI helping human beings and the companies or departments that they work for and work with do their jobs better, or is there some areas where it will in fact replace them entirely over time?
Well, it's absolutely going to replace them. 100%, it's going to replace them, and they should be excited about it. And I realize how callous that might sound, but I want you to hear me out on this. If we go back in time, people were building, they were digging holes with shovels. Now we use tractors and we use forklifts and we use machinery, right? Would you rather be digging a hole with a shovel, or would you rather use a big piece of machinery? Of course, you'd rather use the machinery, right? When the cotton gin came out, right, it put all sorts of people out of work. Well, pulling the seeds out of cotton is really not that fun, right? So there are a lot of jobs that are going to disappear, but there will be new and better jobs created. And the life of the average American is going to become so much better. And I'm normally not like a big guy and let's make predictions, but here I am happy to make a prediction. In our lifetimes, the cost of healthcare is going to come down. I know that's shocking because it's gone up every year since I've been alive. It's going to come down, and it's going to come way down. The quality of education is going to go way up, and the cost of education is going to go way down. In our lifetimes, we're going to have more access and more exposure to wealth. And I mean, not dollars and cents, but wealth in terms of quality of life than humans have ever had before. That's the future we're looking at. It is definitely going to come with upheaval. It's definitely going to cause strife, definitely lots to figure out. But I think the fear mongering comes from those who are trying to protect their rice bowls, and not from those who have an earnest vision of what's going to happen. I'm super excited about this. And by the way, every time society invents a new major technology, whether it's steel, whether it was the internet, whether it was bronze, every time there's upheaval and every time the quality of human life improves.
John Cofrancesco, American AI Logistics. Thanks so much for coming on the Threat Status Podcast. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you so much for having me.
And it's time now for Threat of the Week, our weekly segment here in the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home domestically or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now this week as you all listen to the show. And my threat of the week is problem gambling or even gambling addictions among U.S. troops and the extent to which the Pentagon and the U.S. government itself might be contributing to it. This got on my radar this week because of a new Government Accountability Office report that recommended the Pentagon and each military service take some specific actions related to gambling disorder prevention and identification among young American service members, all American service members. Now, the Pentagon earlier this year did issue new guidance on how to deal with the gambling issue, but the GAO said it's still unclear who has responsibility for certain tasks like diagnosing and treating those with a problem. And the more I dug into it, the more apparent it became that this is a real issue for both active duty troops and veterans. The National Council on Problem Gambling says that 56,000 active duty troops meet the criteria for gambling disorder, meaning they have a preoccupation with it, they can lie about it to their families, etc. Veterans, according to the council, are 2 to 3 times more likely to have a gambling problem. And here's the kicker. The Defense Department currently operates, according to the National Council on Problem Gambling, over 3,000 slot machines on overseas military installations, generating roughly $100 million each year in revenue for the United States government. So look, we don't try to cut down on anybody's freedom to gamble or to smoke cigarettes or to eat whatever food you want, anything you want to do. But it's my threat of the week because it seems like, at least according to a lot of the information that I've dug up this week, the government in some ways could be seen as contributing to this problem while simultaneously not doing enough to prevent it.
Interesting, Ben. It reminds me of General Order Number 1 during the U.S. military invasion of Iraq, which was that U.S. service members were not allowed to drink alcohol during that invasion. And there was always a joke among the many reporters, myself included, who embedded with with the U.S. military in that time frame. And those of us who were dug into the sand in Kuwait. hurrying up and waiting for the order to go across the border into Iraq, that there would be beer in Baghdad. And of course, that for journalists, there was. But on to my threat of the week, Ben. My threat is that we are headed into a new escalation around the Ukraine war. President Trump's promise to end the war has struggled to go anywhere. Russia has indicated it does not want to end the war and is engaging in a rising number of provocations with drones and fighter jet incursions around Europe and beyond. Trump has said NATO countries should down Russian air assets that encroach on their airspace. Imagine if that happens, Ben. My threat is we're headed into a new escalation around the Ukraine war, and this is so dangerous because it involves nuclear armed powers, and the entire global security situation could shift on a dime suddenly and dangerously if things go wrong.
Yeah, we say often we're at a pivotal moment, but we really are with these alleged Russian incursions into NATO airspace repeatedly, including off of Alaska recently. That can spiral out of control, I think, in a hurry. So you're right to highlight it this week. But thank you for that. And of course, a huge thanks to John Cofrancesco from American AI Logistics for that fascinating interview. And a big thanks to all of you, of course, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share the podcast with all of your friends. Guy and I will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.